Hi everyone, I'm Mehak. I head marketing at TestGorilla, and today I'm joined by my colleague Megan, who's our VP of Sales. Over the next hour or so, what we're going to share with you is what we've learned from a survey of over 2,000 hiring leaders and professionals just like you across the US and the UK on how they are hiring for AI fluency. What are they getting right? And more importantly, what are they getting wrong? Where do things break? And then how do we go about and build the right frameworks to fix what's wrong?
Yeah, thanks, Mehak. And I lead our sales team here at TestGorilla, which means that I spend most of my days talking to HR and talent leaders about exactly the problem that you and I are going to unpack together today. So I'll be jumping in throughout with what I'm hearing from the field, directly from our customers, and what's actually working for the teams that we partner with.
Super. So let's get on with it, Megan. Then um, I'd love to tell everyone here that we took the findings from our survey of these 2,000 hiring leaders that I mentioned and several other top resources to create a report on the state of hiring for AI fluency in 2026. Now, I'll be happy to share that report after the session, along with a few key takeaways from it. But more importantly, let's look at what that report means for the next 1 hour. In some ways, this is the outline of the session based on the learnings from the report. We'll diagnose why there's a gap in what companies are looking for when it comes to AI fluent candidates, who they end up hiring. We'll also look at some key differences in how the US market behaves versus how the UK and the rest of Europe is. And then we'll finish with a framework that we've created to help you get your hiring correct. It's a framework that we've built in house that we ourselves use every day. And then we'll close that off with a couple of practical tips from Megan on what you can change in your organization first thing Monday morning to make a measurable difference as soon as we're done here. Now, we have one request to you as questions come along. Please feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll make sure to address them either during the session or we'll batch them up and make sure that we tend to all of them at the end of it. Do we have that in place, Megan, ready to roll?
I think we're good.
Well, so when we started the survey, I want to start with two numbers and I want them to sit with you for a second. This survey across 2,000 hiring leaders in the UK and the US, all involved in hiring decisions where AI fluency matters. And these two findings have stood out so clearly that we built our entire report around it. Number one, 53% of hiring managers now tell us that they prefer a candidate with high AI fluency. One, that they prefer to have fluency over domain expertise. Now, this is a fundamental priority shift for the hiring industry. And it's happened in less than 2 years. If you were to ask the same set of questions 20 to 24 months ago, the numbers would be very different. Number two is that 59% of that group have already made what they call a bad AI hire. Someone who interviewed brilliantly on AI, talked the talk, walked the walk, and then could not deliver on the job. So the market has decided that AI fluency is the new must-have skill, but it's not yet figured out how to verify it. So this is not a candidate problem. So this is not about unpacking what the candidate is getting wrong or how they're working around the system, but this is also a hiring process problem. And this is what we'd like to unpack over the course of the day.
Great. And we actually have a poll for the audience. And here's the question, which is where does your organization actually set its AI fluency bar today? You're going to see 5 options on the screen. Don't overthink it. Pick the closest match. You'll see this pop up that just popped here. We'll give you 30 seconds or so to select where your AI fluency bar is today. And this is actually the most important question that we have in this session because everything that we're about to walk through is really a downstream of where you set this bar with your own teams. So we'll give it a few seconds. All right, so it looks like, oh, we have two top answers. One is independently using AI to complete core work tasks and verify the accuracy of the results, tied with we haven't defined it yet. We haven't defined it yet. I feel like that is very honest. And the group that voted there, you are definitely not alone. In our data here at TestGorilla, around 1 in 5 are approximately in the same place. So the good news is by the end of this session, we're going to give you a structure so that you can kind of take it back to your organization and make real impacts in Monday morning. So keep those answers in mind. We're going to come back to that here as we progress through the session. And we'll have a few more interactive polls for you as we progress today.
That's actually quite an interesting one, Megan, because when we did the survey, almost half of the US organizations ended up being at tool awareness. So I think we're already at a great crowd where you understand that either there isn't a definition set up just yet, or that definition is now set up at independent use, agentic use, and workflow, which is really where that bar should be. So it's a good first number to come in.
Yeah.
I'm going to go on and talk a little bit more around that data, and Megan, that we can address a little bit of why there is some of that numbers discrepancy or the bar discrepancy as well. Now, we have this paradox. The market wants AI fluency, but companies keep hiring people who can't deliver it. And when you dig into the data, it's three things that show up again and again. And I'm going to walk everyone here through it. And Megan, feel free to interject when I think there's something that you see here, which is also very strong in your conversations with prospects and customers. The first diagnosis of why mishires happen is what we call the awareness trap. 46% of US hiring managers have set that AI fluency bar at knowing tools exist. So this room is slightly more advanced at either building it at where it should be or being very honest about saying we just haven't got around to it yet. But the biggest challenge is when you speak in the market, it's being set at being able to talk about or having knowledge of a tool. That's the standard, right? So you name the tools, and if your bar is set at tool awareness, then that's not AI fluency. You're hiring people who we say can keep up with the news. The second diagnosis that we have there, very different from the first one, is the subjectivity trap. So 19% of organizations are leaving AI assessment entirely to individual manager discretion. That means companies don't have a standard rubric. There's no consistency between interviewers. Different teams could prioritize or could measure differently. And maybe we go as far as calling it a little bit of vibe check hiring. So it again goes back to rewarding whoever tells the best story in the room and not whoever can actually do the work. There is a third piece around why such mishires tend to take place, which is the confidence versus competence piece, and it's closely linked to the first two. And this is more structural. We find this a lot around interviews for candidates, where interviews are designed to observe speech, not execution. So a candidate today can learn the language of agentic workflows, RAG, prompt engineering. It takes a good weekend. In fact, today candidates can, with the use of AI, pretty much learn and prepare for a good interview and do it well. So knowing the vocabulary today is no longer the same as knowing the work, and you can have the former without necessarily knowing the latter. And in an interview today, especially with the kind of volume that a lot of the hiring leaders here are dealing with, a 30-minute conversation cannot quite tell you what you've got in front of you. Megan, when you're in conversations with hiring managers, leaders, do you come across some of this, and what's stronger, or which of these misdiagnoses do you find more pertinent?
Yeah, I think this matches exactly what we hear from the talent leaders that we work with every single week. For me, confidence versus competence is one that comes up over and over again, where the person maybe has a great rapport, they're dynamic, they can use the lingo, they can hit the bullet points, and then when they get into the job, it's not the same. So we hear this identical story over and over again. They bring someone in, the interview is strong, and 3 months later, they're realizing that this person can't actually use the tool that they were talking about. They're just able to talk about them confidently or in bullet point format, describe what some of the AI tools can do. So we're hearing this time and time again, and for me, that confidence versus competence is personally so resonant because we see and hear that even in our own hiring, people that can talk about AI versus once we prompt them to do things, we can see that there's a bit of a difference there. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and it gets worse with volume, doesn't it? When you're interviewing a handful, you're still able to pull out or catch some of the unsaid signals. But today, with the current amount of volume of hiring that's taking place, the volume of CVs coming in, with the resume and AI overload, it's becoming so much tougher, isn't it?
It is. I mean, we're seeing tremendously high candidate volume across our customer base for roles that traditionally weren't getting a lot of candidate volume. Many of our customers are seeing between 300 and 600 applicants for one role, even more if it's a highly desirable role, remote location, those sorts of things. And at that kind of volume, as you mentioned, it can be very hard to control unless there's a system in place to control it.
And I don't want to put you in a spot, Megan, or to name someone, but I'm curious to understand currently how are some of these companies navigating through this volume along with this misdiagnosis situation?
Yeah, so those companies are using TestGorilla, of course, and the way that they use TestGorilla is with some of our AI and skills-based tools at the very, very top of the funnel. So before it touches a human, that person has already gone through a system of bias-free checks along the way, whether that be testing for AI skills, whether it be skills-based assessments really aligned to the role, AI-based video interviewing that have already done the heavy lifting so that our customers, by the time they're actually interacting with that human, that candidate, it is what we call the creme de la creme, or the best candidates, the candidates that are most aligned to the needs of the role and the needs of the organization. Because doing it alone and having a team of recruiters, obviously screening through resumes of 500 people, 600 people in some cases, is just a massive, massive lift. And you get to insert fatigue and bias in that on top of things. It adds to a perfect storm. So by using a tool like TestGorilla to screen those folks down and then focusing on those creme de la creme, high value candidates at the end of that experience is typically what our customers do.
And Megan, before we go any further, that it's worth saying out one thing loud. The resume is really no longer a reliable filter, or at least a reliable first filter. Today, with AI polished applications, every candidate now looks like the best candidate on paper.
I think everyone that's currently in this webinar is probably laughing behind their screens, agreeing that every single resume currently looks the same, because they're all popping their resume into ChatGPT or Claude or name any other tool here and having it zhuzh up this resume and to tell this fantastic story. And the story is good as the paper it's written on, right? Because we can say whatever, a resume can say whatever, but we actually need to see these things and hear these things in action and do a really good check to make sure that the person behind that piece of paper can do the job. And that's the tough part. In an AI driven world, that's the tough part because all of these resumes are AI crisp, AI perfection, and it's really tough to investigate the human behind it.
But this puts more pressure on, let's say, every stage that comes after the resume, doesn't it?
It does. It makes every interview and every interaction that much more important because you really have to turn into almost an investigator as the person progresses through the recruiting experience. So the hope is to use a tool like TestGirl at the top to screen through the bulk majority of candidates who just simply aren't a fit. They don't have the right skills for the job. They won't fit in well with the organization. They don't share the same goals. And that way you can really hyper focus really great one-on-one human time with the people that are great candidates, because that investigative piece still needs to happen in these interviews. And we're going to talk, I know today, Mehak, about how our audience can do those things, how they can ask the right questions to make sure that they have the best candidate. But yeah, it does add pressure to every part of the process because you've really got to investigate the human behind the piece of paper, the human behind the resume.
Yeah, and I could be singing to the choir here, but I think it's worth spending a bit of time on really what are these tensions that continue to drive the gap. So one perspective is really to see our data, but a little deep dive into really what is today's hiring leaders work stream like and the tensions they're coping with, because you can't solve if you can't identify what those tensions are. Um, I think the first one that we said, a definition is not a measurement. So 71% of US organizations have not defined AI fluency. Here as well, we had about 30% being very honest to say that they quite haven't defined or come around to defining what that is. Interestingly, more than half of the people we surveyed also said that they can't define it consistently across roles. So a definition that isn't measurable is more of a description and not a very reliable one if it's being used differently to, let's say, higher engineering roles versus sales versus marketing and operational ones. What happens in such a scenario is you tend to fall back on proxies. The same thing, the tool familiarity we spoke about, confident vocabulary, being able to describe a workflow, even years of experience in AI, which is absolutely uncalled for because that is absolutely not valid and that's also learnable in a weekend. And today, putting ChatGPT on your resume is really the equivalent of saying that you're proficient in Microsoft Office. It says a lot, but it doesn't say much either. There's a second tension, and we empathize a lot with the hiring managers and hiring leaders here in this webinar as well. That traditional interviews, now burdened with this volume of candidates coming in, are tending to find storytellers and not executors. So we've touched on this that conversational fluency is not necessarily the same as operational fluency. So interviews currently are structured in a way that they pull out or they observe communication skills, and not every role requires that as a fundamental. And for AI fluency, it makes the gap wider because um, the people who can articulate well need not necessarily be good workers when it comes to working with a brand new technology that we're also all learning to cope and work with as we go along. So this gap is really where most bad hires originate. And that third one, the trap we spoke about around tool awareness. And I know we keep emphasizing this fact, but it's just because this is really where all the mistakes start. So if you're looking to hire today for any form of AI fluency, however you define it, don't define it, or have a poor system in place, the bar gets set at tool awareness. And this is then left a lot to the subjectivity of the hiring manager in how that narrative is built around tool awareness. And again, I want to reiterate, knowing a tool is not fluency, it's simply exposure. It's knowing what you've learned over the weekend and keeping up with what's in the news.
Yeah, and what I find interesting when we talk to talent leaders, really across the globe, because TestGorilla is a global organization, so we talk to folks from all corners of the earth, and they all recognize all three of these the moment we name them, that we discuss them. They're not new problems, but what is new is that AI has made these things really impossible to ignore. When you had 10, 20 applicants per job, you could kind of afford a vibe check. But now when these organizations are seeing 2, 4, 600 applicants per job, and they look at resumes and they all look the same, they sound the same on paper, they all have the AI glossiness. That's really difficult, right? So we do have another poll for the audience coming up next on the next slide. Let's talk about the tensions that live most in our audience or organizations. So what tensions live in your org right now? Don't answer with the one that should be true. Be honest. Give the correct answer, the one that actually exists today. We're going to give it about 30 or so seconds and see which tension is most live in your org right now. A definition but can't measure it consistently, interviews that aren't predicting on the job AI performance, or our fluency bar is set too low. We really are just checking for awareness. All right, so it looks like our fluency bar is set to low, awareness only. I could have called that out. I had a sense that that one was going to win again. And really, that's an honest answer. The data backs that up. I think it's about 46 or so percent of US managers are in the exact same place. And the good news is that this is fixable. It's fixable upstream before the first interview. We're going to give you some tools to do that and to solve that for your organization immediately today, tomorrow, and start to shore up this hiring process. So hold on to your answer because what we're going to show you is going to look a little bit different depending on which one of those that you picked for your own organization. So let us show you what happens when the bar gets set wrong by comparing two different markets.
Yeah, and it's important to spend a little bit of time here looking at the US and the UK. That's when we had a split audience across both the countries, just to understand a little bit of where the numbers were and where some of the findings were quite different one to the other. So 30%, or in fact 33% of US organizations report that a team member's over-reliance on AI has led to an error in the last 6 months. Now, in the UK, that number is only at 13%. So that's almost 20 percentage points difference. Now, you would consider them in the same mind space, so the same global economy, the same kind of roles, possibly the same tech environment. And yet, there's a stark difference when it comes to on the job AI-driven errors. Um, so the question would be, what is UK doing differently? And it turns out that there's quite a bit actually that there are some useful lessons maybe that can be taken across from one market to another. And almost all of that, what's being done differently is before the first interview takes place. To that point again, that 45% of US organizations have set their bar at tool awareness. We're also very happy to understand here. No, not pleased in that sense of the way, but to see a certain resonance that within your organizations, the tension that's most live is that bar being set too low. In the UK, that figure is fairly lower at 29%. So the UK is more likely to require the thresholds of independent use, of verification, which is definitely a meaningfully higher standard when it comes to AI fluency. And the result downstream is the error data that we start with, right? It's garbage in, garbage out. It's something most technology teams understand, and it's something that has been valid across all technologies that are there. And it applies to hiring as well. So the quality of the standard that you set upstream determines the quality of the outcome downstream. Um, the US also, so to my mind, what I take away from this data are a few things. The US has a conviction problem. The UK has a bit more of a capacity problem. Both are fixable, but only one starts by admitting that the bar is too low. So that's where the US is currently sitting when you look at what's happening in their hiring scenario.
Yeah, and I think that this is tying to what we see in the field out in the wild with our prospects, with our customers. What I find really interesting is when a bar is set at tool awareness, how that impacts the frequent AI-driven errors reported, number there at the bottom. But the first piece, and simply even coming to the webinar today is the first step into building a more robust program internally for your own teams, because the world is changing. The world is changing quickly, and now is the time to say, listen, we're all aware of ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini and some of these other tools. The awareness is, to hack to your point earlier, it's like saying Microsoft Word. Okay. But now is the time to kind of turn up the heat and start early on in the hiring process before you get that garbage out, as you've mentioned. So I think this is super resonant, and it's really the time now for teams to activate this muscle internally as part of the hiring process to make sure that everything downstream, after the application, after that interview, is setting that organization up for success and on the path to AI fluency internally.
And this is massive tension. There's no denying that today's recruiter, hiring manager, people person has a tremendous amount of pressure to find that AI fluent talent and to build capability within the organization. And some of these percentages here, 62%, so that's almost two-thirds of of people we've spoken with who can't define fluency across tech and non-tech roles. And I guess that's where the challenge is of where does it stand for tech teams versus non-tech teams. But also almost two-thirds lacking any internal stakeholder alignment when it comes on AI augmentation. That's a lot of pressures. Where do you set the bar? How do you define the bar? And then how do you take your organization along with you on that curve and on that transformation as well?
Exactly. I agree. I agree. And I think that, like I said, starting that process now before there's multiple months of errors and mishires is critically important for any organization. So, like I said, the first step is showing up today, and the awareness of those things and the honesty really shared in some of the polls, that, hey, we haven't really defined it. Now is the time to define those things and getting the tools to support you as you do that. So essentially, kind of what we've laid out what's wrong, and we've shown you the cost of getting it wrong. I'm sure all of our audience has experiences and examples of how these things have gone wrong internally. The next question that we get from every talent leader that we work with is kind of an obvious one, which is, okay, cool. We know we're doing this wrong. We know we can do it better. But what do we actually do about it? What are some of these steps? So from us and our point of view, really three things have to happen. So the first is that we need to turn definitions into actual measurements. You mentioned that earlier, Mehak, about actually measuring things versus just defining them. Two is that we need interviews that find executors, not storytellers. That's really important. Someone who talks a good game, super dynamic, has a bullet point list of vocabulary. Not always the person is going to execute well, so it's important to kind of sniff that out as part of the recruiting process. And then three, we need to raise the floor on what actually counts as fluent in the first place. And that's interesting because to me, what looked like fluent 6 months ago, we're not even talking a year or two ago, right? What looked like fluency 6 months ago is so much different than what fluency looks like today, and will continue to evolve in what fluency looks like over time. So all three of these are easier when you have some sort of shared structure. So we're actually going to share one that we use ourselves every single day in our own hiring at TestGorilla. So Mehak, if you wouldn't mind walking us through what we do at TestGorilla.
Yeah, and before we jump there, I do want to say that a lot of organizations have been very open about sharing how they look at AI fluency, how they're measuring candidates against it. And I do want to bring to Megan's point that it's important to understand that what's valid today was not valid 6 months ago and may not hold true 6 months ahead. So when we've built the framework, and I'm just going to pop it up on everyone's screen here. Um, this is a framework by our own talent and assessment science team, grounded in IO psychology research, validated against job performance data, and designed to generate what we call observable signals across both in technical roles. What makes it useful, and we do tend to use it ourselves as well as encourage all our customers to do so, is that this is not contingent on where the technology is. So the tech can evolve, the way we engage with AI and technology can evolve. The framework continues to hold valid. You'll just end up adjusting to where it's weighted depending on what seniority and roles there are, but the framework sort of holds and remains standing. So it's one important framing point. Now, this is not a diagnostic tool, so this is not a 2020 split across all five. It's not a fixed hierarchy, so the numbers 1 to 5 don't have any vertical order to them. What it does is it makes sure that no critical dimension is being skipped quietly. And we do tend to, across certain roles, often skip one for the other. I'm going to talk you through these before I then go to Megan and just understand from her how customers and how our prospects are discussing some of these frameworks as they come in for roles. But first up, the 5 pillars. The first one is applied AI use in workflow. So this is the direct one. Can candidates, can your team members, can those in the recruitment process, can they actually execute end-to-end tasks with AI, or is it just stopping at conversational? So do they know how to speak and talk about tools? They can actually get hands-on. The other pillar is, and probably one of the more relevant ones when we talk about changing technology, is learning and digital agility. So, can they adapt when tools change, when technology changes, when there's some uncertainty that in 6 months we're not aware of what could be the latest tooling, tech, and systems that are in there? Because absolutely, these tools are going to change. The third pillar then is what we call systems thinking and problem solving. This is the ability to take one step back and to see the bigger picture. So, do they understand how the AI use ripples across the team, across businesses? Um, Something that doesn't break processes, something that can 10x themselves. Are they able to use AI and then think of it in terms of systems rather than one single use case, which may have negative or ripple effects upstream or downstream? The fourth pillar then is responsible and ethical AI use. This is around a very basic question, right? Do they have the judgment to catch a hallucination? Do they have the judgment to catch an error before it becomes a larger problem, before it becomes the foundations for an incorrect strategy, or before it tends to become a legal problem? And then the fifth one is human AI collaboration. So, can they document and communicate the AI logic to a colleague? Can they bring other colleagues and team members along? Because one person's usage is not going to be a company's transformation. Can they audit it? Can they learn? And can they build on it? So, taken together, these five pillars shift the hiring question from do you know AI to three harder ones, but also more useful ones. Can you deliver with AI? Can you be trusted with it? And can you help others reach your level to bring about actual transformation inside your organization?
Yeah, I love that. And I think, as I look through all of these and some of the roles that we hire at TestGorilla, our audience might be looking at these, and from my point of view, it's perfectly okay to kind of weight some of these depending on the role itself and what the role requires. One of the ones for me personally, as I recruit and hire for my own teams under TestGorilla, is the digital agility and learning ability, because I am hyper aware that these tools will change. And so as I'm looking at candidates, I'm thinking, is this person, can they adapt to change? Are they willing to change? Are they going to grasp new technologies as they emerge and shift their thinking? Or are they going to be a person that stalls and only wants to be learn one thing and stick there forever? So, as you were calling these out, Mehak, I'm even thinking about my own recruiting and how I see folks and how I ask them questions as part of the interview experience, to fit into this framework, which I feel is so valuable. And what I feel is very valuable about this practice, or in practice, is that it really does work for any role. Mehak, I know you obviously hire for a lot of marketing roles. We've hired for GTM engineers and RevOps and sales folks. And we've seen our own customers use this framework to assess engineers and finance teams and customer success leaders, because those underlying behaviors kind of travel. So even when the tools and the vocabulary aren't exactly the same, it's that the behaviors, the framework that really identify whether or not this person is going to bring AI fluency into the organization. So, as an example, an AI fluent marketer and an AI fluent engineer probably don't look the same, right? They're going to talk about different tools and using different tools in different ways, and that's okay. But the way they reason about AI, the way that they verify outputs, that process, the way that they hand off work, all of those things, there's really that common thread, and they're remarkably similar across all of those different roles. When we at TestGorilla, we asked about 750 hiring managers to rank these pillars in order of importance. Their answers were almost uniformly distributed. No pillar dominated, yet no pillar got ignored either, which tells us that hiring managers are really seeing that full picture. They just don't have a vocabulary internally to talk about these things consistently, right? So that you can use this language across the entire org, and from the recruiting team to the hiring managers, everyone's all on that same page. And for me, at least in my experience with TestGorilla, this is what this framework gives me internally, and as we partner with our own recruiting team, and is very valuable for our own customers, right? So that they can talk about these things across the org using that same language.
Yeah, and one of the things, Megan, we've noticed is fast-growing companies are often guilty of probably leaning a bit more towards pillars one and two, and larger organizations or the more global ones tend to err more on the side of ethics, responsibility, and human AI collaboration. So while we've of course got an interesting poll where it's fairly balanced out, but I think companies are guilty of tending to favor one versus the other depending on where they are in their maturity curve.
I agree with you. I agree with you there. But it is really interesting. I think that, you know, whether or not an org kind of weights one more than the other, having that framework, having that common language across the org, and really looking into these 5 pillars is critically important. It gives you that solid baseline to work from. So we do have another poll for the audience. Share that on screen here. So now that you've seen those 5 pillars, very curious, which one do you think is the hardest to assess in an interview? So when a candidate's sitting across from you, which pillar do you find that it might be the hardest to kind of get a read on? So I'll give you 30 seconds. And we have applied AI use in workflow, learning and digital agility, systems thinking and problem solving, responsible and ethical AI use, or human AI collaboration. And this question actually matters more than maybe appears on face value, because the pillar that you find the hardest to assess is usually the one that you end up underweighting in the hiring decision, whether you mean to or not. And let's see our answers. Okay, so we have responsible and ethical AI use. The challenge here is that candidates know the right answer in the abstract. Everyone says that they verify outputs, of course. They watch for bias, of course. But the real work is finding out whether they actually do those things and do it under time pressure. So that's, you know, a very different type of question, a very different type of evidence, because asking someone, do you verify the outputs? Yes is the easiest response. Do you check for bias? Yes is the easiest response, but where can you go from there? So let's walk through that with our audience, Mehak. All right, so we're going to change what you ask. This is probably what I would say is the easiest change that our audience can make on Monday morning because it costs nothing. You don't need to buy anything or build anything or really convince anyone. You just change 3 simple questions. Instead of asking, what AI tools do you use? Instead, ask, walk me through the last time AI gave you a wrong answer. How did you catch it? And listen for the response. So the first question is going to give you some vocabulary. The second question, the how did you catch it, is going to get you judgment, verification, ownership of the output. You're going to see them walking through in real time in their brain a scenario that they actually did that or not. And if they haven't, then that's a game changer as well in an interview. But that gives you both sides of that coin. For the next one, instead of asking, how comfortable are you with ChatGPT, or do you use ChatGPT, you might ask, tell me about a workflow that you redesigned with AI, and what did you stop doing? So the first question, you can't really falsify that. There's going to be an example given there. And the second one really forces them to point to something real that changed, an improvement that they made, something that illuminated some business results. It's a very powerful question to have someone walk through a very specific example. And then instead of asking, do you understand prompt engineering? ask, show me a prompt that failed and how you fixed it. So the first one is yes or no. We don't want yes or no questions because the response is, of course, always going to be favorable. But the second one is really metacognition, learning agility, applied use, all in one answer. And that's really what we're looking for. That's where the goal of that interview is. So the questions on the left are all going to just observe speech. And you're going to get very simple one word, two-word responses that don't really give you much of an indication of this candidate's ability to use these tools in the workplace. While the questions on the right are going to observe thinking and process and judgment. And that's really the shift that you're trying to make here. You're not asking for the fluency or a confirmation that someone will give you that they understand fluency. It transitions it to asking for evidence of fluency and process. And that evidence is much, much harder to fake than vocabulary because, to your point, Mehak, you can spend a weekend preparing for an interview, get your bullet points, and talk through AI fluency at a high level. But once you actually ask for concrete examples, you can see how that person works with AI, how they've worked with AI in the past, how they think about these things. So this is a very simple, in my opinion, very simple change that you can walk into on Monday morning. You can deploy this in your very next interview, hand it out to hiring managers across the line, and really switch this to behavioral and process-based questions. Now, we do have a question from the audience. I'm going to pass this one. I'm going to ask you, Mehak, this question. So, do you need to evaluate all 5 pillars, or can a company start by focusing on just one in the beginning? What do you think?
I think the mistake that most companies end up doing is focusing or favoring one over the other. So our strong suggestion, and I'm going to just walk us back to the pillars there, is to use all 5. However, the weightage of each is where you have room to adapt and adjust. So if you will identify candidates who are, let's say, very strong with applied AI use, but lack human AI collaboration, then effectively they're a team of one. And when they leave, the knowledge leaves. But also, it's just them. They don't take the company along or the team along on that transformation curve. Similarly, if you tend to lean more towards system thinking, responsibility, governance without actually testing capability, well, let's not go away from the actual physical ability to build in today's technology, then again, you're favoring a little more on the philosophical side than on the hands-on side. So we say keep all 5 in front of you, put them as to whatever degree of measurement that you'd like. So one could be 10%, the other could be 30%, but use all 5 because that's when you will genuinely get an AI fluent candidate.
Absolutely. I fully agree there. So now we've given you some tools, some simple questions that you can change. And so Mehak, over to you on the
Yes.
AI era hiring stack.
Absolutely. And it's not easy to be a hiring manager. I'm just reflecting on our conversation so far, and it's already complicated. The CV is already becoming weak in its signal. And now you've got to look at agility, ability, AI fluency. There's just more and more and more. And probably one of the harder jobs in today's era is to be in hiring and recruitment. So, really, the question is how do you hire for the AI era? And we're keen to talk to you a little bit about the stack that works at this point. So, when the CV is the signal and the signal is broken, then what has to replace it is infrastructure. I will be honest in saying that this is the stack that we encourage and run at TestGorilla because honestly, we drink our own champagne because it works, but also because we wouldn't ask a customer or anyone here to run a process that we're not willing to run ourselves. So, yes, this is part of our product and this is part of how we do things at TestGorilla, but this is so intrinsic to how we look at the AI era hiring and how it's a success for recruiters. First up and most critical today is ID verification to prove it's really the candidate. It's unfortunate, but with AI and booming technology, the first use cases of that technology are not always positive. And therefore, ID verification is the most important process in your hiring stack. Next up, and we are very biased towards it, of course, is our skills tests. They really allow you to move beyond the 100% CV keyword match or the AI slop, and to test for role relevant, scientifically backed pieces and questions around it. For our AI roles, especially the show and tell piece, so not the talk about, but also if you're saying talk about, tell me when it went wrong, tell me how you fixed it, but essentially to couple a bunch of skills tests to really be able to get from the candidate their hard skills and their soft skills along with the AI fluency skills, which is the third important piece of the stack. Even if you're not a company today hiring for AI fluency, or if you're not in the, you don't believe you're in that 5%, we definitely need cutting edge technology, there is no denying that you do need some degree of AI fluency within your organization. So keep in mind the 5 pillar framework and also some degree of cognitive testing there. We strongly recommend AI video interviews. There is no way that you can screen at scale. I was recently speaking to a media outlet, and I told them that for most recruiters today, your short list has become a long list. And therefore, you need many more methods and scoring on the way to be able to arrive at that final short list. So, of course, there's a lot in the market. You can have one-way video interviews, you can have audio interviews, we have AI avatar interviews as well, but all of them score consistently, fairly, and most importantly, give hiring managers, recruiters their time back. This time is invaluable because in the conversations that follow is when you will really be able to ask and measure and judge a candidate properly. Today, a good hire is somebody who is fit for the role, is a culture fit, is adaptable, is AI fluent, and that's already 9 pillars that you're measuring someone against. So take your time and make sure that you're really, really speaking to the right kind of shortlist to be able to get that final candidate. And the final piece, of course, of the AI era hiring stack, as we call it, is structured evaluation. So at no point are we encouraging a fully agentic flow. There is a need for human in the loop, but you need augmentation with data and AI. At no point are we recommending or leaning towards any sort of replacement.
I think that's really an important point that you make, Mehak. You made a couple really important points that I hear time and time again from our prospects and customers, which is they have a knowledge that they need to measure these things and a desire to measure all of these things. But when you're one human and you have 600 applications, it's impossible to do these things on your own without the support of tools. And whatever tools you choose to interact with, whether it's skills tests or AI fluency assessments and AI video interviews, putting those before the human allows that human to spend better quality time with the candidates, because there's just so many of them at the top of the funnel. It just becomes impossible. To your point of the recruiting role and the hiring manager role right now is more complex than ever, because you have to identify all of these things that make someone a great fit for your organization and a great fit for your role. There are tools to do that, right? And to help you in a bias-free way and get that time back that you've mentioned, which is really important to our customers, because they want to screen all these things, but how is one person, can you actually do this with 600 applicants that are coming into your hiring funnel? You can't. You need some tools to support you. But we like this structure. We use these, like Mehak said, for our own recruiting at TestGorilla. And the interesting one for me is the ID verification. Mehak, as you mentioned, a very important piece, prove it's really them. Probably about 3 or 4 times a week, I hear a horror story from someone that talks about they hired someone that they thought was a person and ended up not being them. So that is real in the market. AI bots, fake people, applying for roles. So all of those pieces, it's just a different world than we were in 12 months ago, 24 months ago. So it's prudent to make sure that we're looking at all aspects of the recruiting process for our prospects and for our customers. So thank you for
And this
sharing.
This hasn't jumped up yet, but at most other places, when we bring up AI video interviews, there are quite a few questions around the scoring, the transparency piece. And one of the points we always maintain is transparency is your right, both as a customer and as a candidate, so ask for it. The onus is on companies like ours to explain and have a fair amount of explainability around how the scoring is working, why it is giving the score it is. But don't make AI interviews one bad experience away from, being the next big bad word.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to then go on to really, what do you do Monday morning then? Maybe I pick up the first one, Megan, and toss the next
Yeah.
one to you. Uh, but one I always say is play one is replace any sort of discretion with a shared rubric. So if the fluency bar is sitting in someone's head or in a scribble on a post-it somewhere, then it doesn't exist. So the fastest way to fix what we call that subjectivity trap that we referred to earlier is to give every interviewer the same yardstick. So pick the pillars from the framework, write down what an answer looks like, or what a good answer would look like, and not the words that it would have or the vocabulary it would include, but the structure of what a good answer would merit. And brief every interviewer before they walk into the room to interview. It sounds basic, but if you go back to our survey, it's also the thing that 20% of organizations are skipping entirely.
Yeah, and I think play two, as I mentioned in the last slide, is use tools to get your time back. Right now the recruiters on your team are managing such a high volume, and that becomes the focus instead of making really smart decisions that they want to do, that they're talented to do, but they're just stuck in this volume play right now. Hundreds of these AI generated, AI polished, AI perfect applications that are just impossible to differentiate on paper is what they're swimming through right now. But AI fluency assessments, some of the other tools, Mehak, that you mentioned that we use internally at TestGorilla can do that differentiation and identify the differentiation for those recruiters for that team before a first interview is had. So before a human touches it, which is a really valuable point of time and piece of time, these assessments have done the heavy lifting. And to your point, we don't want you to replace your team's judgment. The point is to give them the time to have that judgment and to give them that judgment back by removing the massive volume and clutter and fakeness that's burying it today in today's market. So I think that's a really critical piece.
Yeah, and then the third one, which I think Megan and I unanimously agree on, don't wake up Monday morning and decide you're going to change everything. Start by one role. So don't rebuild your entire hiring process at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning. Pick any one open role that you currently have. Try and apply the framework to it. So run two tracks side by side, actually, your standard process and the new one. Compare and see who makes it through. Allow that data to change your mind. The newer way is definitely a harder one. There are more frameworks and yardsticks and elements of measurement, but it's also one that prevents you from having a mishire and lost time. So, my strong recommendation for a successful transformation is to start with one role.
Yeah, and none of this requires necessarily a new tech stack. It's just a different set of decisions at a few very specific points, and that's all.
Thank you for joining us.